Meredith stood in the doorway, her hand hovering just above the polished doorknob. Her heart raced, but not from excitement. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Don't be nervous, Meredith. It's just one night. Nothing will happen." But as she entered the dimly lit room, her resolve faltered. There he was, His Majesty, sitting on the edge of the bed, his posture hunched and frail. He looked worse than she imagined. His skin was sallow, his eyes darkened with exhaustion, and his hands shook like they could barely hold his own weight. The occasional cough rattled from his chest, and Meredith's stomach tightened at the sight. "No one told me he was ill," she thought, her gaze lingering on his pale face. Even without being informed, it was painfully clear he wasn't in any condition to consummate their marriage. She let out a soft sigh, feeling a wave of relief mixed with guilt. All she wanted was to slip into bed and sleep, to avoid whatever awkwardness lay ahead. But then, a faint metallic scent caught her nose. "What is that?" she murmured to herself, her eyes scanning the room. And then, as if he sensed her confusion, His Majesty chuckled weakly. "You caught me." Meredith's breath hitched in her throat. How could this sickly man, who could barely stand during the wedding ceremony, be standing before her now, speaking so casually? He mustered a smile, but there was something unsettling about it. Is this really the man I married? She wondered, her mind flashing back to 3 months earlier when her life had taken an unexpected turn. It was a typical day, or so Meredith thought, until her father summoned her into his study. His voice was calm, almost too calm, when he said, "I want you to get married." Meredith blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" To His Majesty, her father continued, his expression unreadable. "The wedding will take place in 3 months. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard him. Marry the emperor? Why her? And why now? She wasn't the eldest daughter, Catalina was, and yet here she was, being thrust into a royal marriage. She tried to protest. "One moment, Your Grace. I don't understand." But her father's patience had limits. "What part of this do you not understand, Meredith?" His stern gaze silenced her, and she realized arguing was pointless. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Her thoughts spiraled. Why would her father want her to marry the emperor? Meredith had long accepted her place in the family, an illegitimate child, living under the shadow of her half-sister Catalina, always overlooked and underestimated. Her father's decision baffled her, and yet here she was 3 months later, standing in the emperor's bedchamber, wondering what had led to this moment. Catalina and her stepmother had been strangely silent about the arrangement, and that only made Meredith more suspicious. Why weren't they doing everything in their power to stop this? They had never wanted her to have a suitable match before. Why were they so content now? As Meredith looked back at the emperor, now coughing again, she couldn't shake the feeling that this marriage was not about love or power. It was a transaction. Her father's orders had felt more like a sale than a union. He wanted her out of the way, and what better way than to marry her off to the most powerful man in the kingdom? She felt a chill run down her spine. There was more to this marriage than met the eye, and Meredith wasn't sure she was ready to uncover the truth. Meredith sat in front of the grand mirror in her room, gazing at the reflection of her newly gifted dress. Her fingers traced the intricate embroidery as her mind swirled with unease. The Duke and Duchess of Schwartz are pure bloods, and so is their daughter, Catalina, she whispered to herself, her voice tinged with bitterness. I am the only flaw in Catalina Schwartz's otherwise perfect life. It was no secret that her family despised her. The Duke and Duchess never missed an opportunity to remind her of her place, and Catalina? She treated Meredith like she was nothing more than a pest, a cockroach beneath her shoe. The mere thought of it made her chest tighten with frustration. How was she supposed to understand the will of her parents when they had never shown her an ounce of love or affection? Still, Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sudden kindness from the Duchess? The dress sent to her for a tea party at the Cubram estate? It didn't add up. Her parents had never celebrated her birthday, let alone sent her gifts. Why now? Out of the blue. Diane, Meredith called softly to her maid, who stood nearby, ever watchful. Doesn't it strike you as strange? Her Grace has never involved me in high society before. Why now? Diane hesitated, unsure of what to say. Perhaps they've changed their minds, my lady. Maybe they want what's best for you. Meredith scoffed. Best for me? The idea seemed laughable. Catalina had ridiculed her only days before. The sudden shift in their behavior was too strange to ignore. A person doesn't change overnight, she muttered. Why would they want me to wear this fancy frock when they never acknowledged me before? It's as if they're parading me for the first time. The next day, as Meredith prepared to attend the tea party, the dread settled in her bones. She walked through the halls, hearing whispers behind her back. And then, as she approached the carriage, Catalina's cold voice pierced the air. Oh, that's what is here. Meredith froze for a second before moving closer. She would be sharing a carriage with them. The Duchess's command cut through the air. Enough talking, Meredith. We must make haste. Then something unexpected happened. From now on, don't refer to me as Your Grace, the Duchess said, her tone clipped but not unkind. Call me Mother, and refer to Catalina as your sister. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. Mother. The word felt foreign on her tongue, like a name she was never meant to say aloud. Catalina remained quiet, her usual sharpness subdued. What was happening? They reached the estate, the grand Cubrim mansion looming ahead. As the Duchess introduced her to Lady Cubrim, Meredith felt a chill run down her spine. Oh, this is my younger daughter, Meredith Schwartz, the Duchess said, her voice smooth and rehearsed. Lady Cubrim raised an eyebrow. Another daughter? Why haven't we seen her before? She's been frail since birth. The Duchess responded with a calmness that only made Meredith feel sicker. The hypocrisy dripped from every word, and Meredith couldn't help but feel like a skeleton being pulled from the Duchess's closet, only to be paraded in front of society now that they had plans for her. Meredith forced a smile and greeted Lady Cubrim, but the bile rose in her throat. Just because they wished to marry her off to the Emperor, they suddenly cared. The thought made her nauseous. They were only kind to her now because she had value, something to offer, a union with the Emperor himself. We've said hello to nearly everyone, the Duchess whispered to her once they moved through the crowd. Get used to it. You shall soon become the Empress of Vatesign. Meredith's heart pounded in her chest. The Empress. It felt strange introducing herself as Meredith Schwartz to the noble women, knowing soon enough she'd be part of the royal family. She had only attended small gatherings before, but now she'd be expected to navigate grand banquets, lavish balls, and the intrigues of palace life. Even with the uncertainty looming over her, Meredith held on to a small glimmer of hope. Things had to get better, didn't they? As much as she loathed being paraded around like a prize, perhaps life in the palace, far away from Catalina and the Duke and Duchess, would offer her the freedom she so desperately craved. I know it will, she whispered to herself, clutching the fabric of her dress as she stepped further into the lion's den of high society. The social events seemed endless, each one more exhausting than the last. Meredith Schwartz found herself smiling through gritted teeth as she greeted yet another noblewoman, repeating the same rehearsed line over and over again. Greetings, I'm Meredith Schwartz. She had been forced to play the part of the perfect lady, and the palace had even sent a governess to teach her royal etiquette. Her days were spent learning how to hold herself like an empress, how to maintain a flawless complexion, and how to speak in that polished, emotionless tone that high society demanded. It took more than she could have imagined to prepare for a future as the empress of an empire. But it wasn't just about learning the rules. It was about surviving. 3 months of this routine dragged by until the day finally came, the day of her wedding. Meredith stood before her maid, who fussed over her sparse belongings. We don't have much luggage, my lady. Are you sure you don't need to pack anything else? No, I'm good, Meredith replied with a quiet firmness. Her things were cheap, meaningless trinkets that held no value to her now. I'd like to be as light as possible. It's a new beginning for me, a new beginning. The words felt both hopeful and bitter. When she was first told about the marriage, she had been frozen in shock. 3 months to prepare to marry a man she had never met. She hadn't known what to do at the time, but now that the moment was here, she was ready. Not for the wedding itself, but for the freedom it would bring her. This marriage was her escape, her excuse to leave the Schwartz family behind, once and for all. Her thoughts wandered to her mother, Meryl, a woman long lost to tragedy. Meryl had been a gypsy who worked as a maid for the Schwartz family. Her mere presence had angered the Duchess to no end, and though she had wanted a better life for Meredith, fate had torn them apart. An accident had taken her mother's life soon after she left, leaving Meredith trapped in the clutches of a family that despised her. As she prepared to leave, Meredith's heart ached with a strange mixture of emotions. Would the Duchess or Catalina come to say goodbye? Of course not. Meredith knew better than to expect that. She stood before the Duchess, who barely looked at her. "I'll be taking my leave now." The Duchess waved her off without emotion. "You do that. And don't forget, you must not bring shame to our family." Meredith's chest tightened. "Yes, Your Grace." She bowed her head and left the room. She had no idea why she had allowed herself to hope for even a glimmer of approval. Her father wasn't even there to send her off. What had she expected? Love? Pride? She was a fool to think they would care. Stepping into the royal palace felt like entering a new world. "Greetings, Your Majesty. Welcome to your royal palace," a voice called out. Meredith looked up to see a woman approaching, dressed elegantly and carrying herself with a calm confidence. "I am Julia Renati, and I will be your lady-in-waiting." The woman introduced herself with a warm smile. Meredith managed a small nod. "It's a pleasure to see you again, Lady Julia." Julia raised an eyebrow. "You must change how you speak. We went through this a few days ago, remember?" Meredith's cheeks flushed. "Oops. Don't worry, we still have time until the wedding," Julia said reassuringly. "You'll need to change how you speak to the staff once you become Empress. You may speak formally to members of high society, but not to us." Meredith nodded again, her mind swimming. There were so many rules in this palace, so many expectations she would have to meet. As the minutes ticked down to the ceremony, Meredith's nerves began to build. "Julia," she called softly, "tell me about His Majesty. I've never met him before. No one in my family told me anything about him." Julia smiled, though there was a tinge of sadness in her eyes. "His Majesty is a good man. He has a wonderful personality, and he's very handsome." Meredith wasn't sure why, but something about this reassured her. But still, a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. "Why am I here instead of Catalina?" she wondered to herself. Catalina was the favorite, the perfect daughter. Why had her father chosen Meredith to become the next empress? The doors to the hall swung open, and all eyes turned toward her. "All hail Her Majesty!" a voice cried, and Meredith's heart raced. Her gaze shifted to the man standing at the altar, her soon-to-be husband. He was stunning, like a statue carved out of marble. But something was off. His eyes were sunken, his complexion pale. His hands, when they met hers, were as cold as ice. Meredith's instincts flared. Something was wrong. His Majesty looked ill, but no one seemed concerned. No one except her. As the vows were spoken, Meredith's thoughts raced. Why am I the one marrying him? She glanced at the Duke and Duchess in the crowd, their expressions unreadable. It hit her like a tidal wave. They had known all along. His Majesty didn't have much time left. "I do," Meredith said, her voice trembling. She finally understood. They hadn't chosen her because she was special. They chose her because Catalina deserved better than a dying man. The voices around Meredith buzzed with shallow congratulations, but her mind wandered elsewhere. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," someone said as they bowed low. Meredith offered a polite nod, her face unreadable. "Thank you, my lady," she murmured, though the words barely left her lips. "We hope you create a beautiful family with His Majesty." A beautiful family? The phrase echoed in her mind, but she couldn't summon the same hope. How could I? She thought. His Majesty hadn't looked well. Hours earlier, during the wedding, Meredith had noticed the way he winced with every step, his face pale, his body frail. It was as if no one else saw it, or maybe they all did, but chose to ignore the truth. Am I the only one who's noticed? Meredith glanced around at the gossiping courtiers. She overheard a whisper. Did her parents trick her into this marriage? I'm sure she knew what she was getting into. Someone else muttered. What parent would hide such an ugly truth from their daughter? Meredith clenched her jaw. They all knew. Everyone except me. The Schwartz family had kept her in the dark, using her like a pawn. But what could she have done? Born out of wedlock, Meredith never had a choice in the matter. Defying the Schwartz family wasn't an option for someone like her. But now I am the Empress of Valtsign. The weight of the title pressed on her shoulders, heavier than she could have imagined. She had to survive on her own, learn how to fend for herself in a world full of enemies. The court, her family, even the Emperor himself, they were all potential threats. Another voice interrupted her thoughts. Congratulations on your marriage, Your Majesty. We hope you have a wonderful life with His Majesty. Meredith forced another smile, though the bitterness inside her grew. Thank you, she said quietly. The courtier leaned in, her voice low and cutting. You don't look very happy, Your Majesty. We expected you to be over the moon. Her words dripped with mockery. Or perhaps, being a bastard child and all? Are you worried you'll have no one to rely on? Before Meredith could respond, Catalina, her half-sister, stepped forward. That's enough, she said with a sly smirk. My apologies, Your Majesty. Meredith's blood boiled. They're here to mock me, she thought, her eyes narrowing. Catalina knew exactly what she was doing. I'm sure you now know your place, Your Majesty, she seemed to say without words. The malice behind Catalina's smile was unmistakable. Meredith longed to strike back, to tear apart the family name that had chained her for so long. But Catalina was right about one thing. She had no supporters within the palace. She couldn't afford to make enemies so soon. She had to bide her time, lay low, and gather her strength. The Schwartz family is powerful, but they must have collaborators inside the palace, she reasoned. Did the Emperor make a deal with the Duke? Her thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. If only I had someone backing me. But as she balled her hands into fists, she felt a sharp sting. She had unknowingly cut into her palm, her fingers clenched so tightly that her nails had drawn blood. Diane, Meredith called softly. Her maid hurried over, towel in hand. Yes, Your Majesty? Meredith took a deep breath, the pain from her palm grounding her. The only thing I have going for me right now is my ability to heal. The secret she had kept hidden all her life, the power she had inherited from her mother, Meryl, a gypsy. Her healing powers were forbidden in Valtsign, outlawed for as long as anyone could remember. No one knew where these powers originated, and there were few left who possessed them. This power is all I have left, Meredith thought grimly. If I need to, I will use it. But using her healing powers could mean the end for her if anyone found out. Could she really keep them hidden here, in the palace, surrounded by watchful eyes? She glanced at her lady-in-waiting, Julia, who had appeared quietly in the doorway. Your Majesty, Julia said, her tone somber. Meredith turned, a question in her eyes. It's time? Julia hesitated before finishing her sentence. For you to consummate your marriage with His Majesty. Meredith's heart sank. She knew it would come to this. How am I supposed to do this when the man barely seems alive? His cold hands and sunken eyes flashed in her mind again. She felt trapped, not by duty, but by the reality that no one here truly cared for her well-being. Very well, Meredith said softly, her voice calm, though inside she was anything but. I will survive this, no matter what it takes. Meredith sat in front of her vanity, staring at her reflection. The night was closing in, and her mind whirled with unease. Julia, her ever-faithful lady-in-waiting, stood by her side, silent and nervous. Meredith's voice broke the tense air. It's time for me to consummate my marriage with His Majesty, isn't it? Julia flinched at the question. Yes, Your Majesty, she replied, but there was hesitation in her voice. Meredith noticed the unease in Julia's posture and turned to her, suspicion creeping into her heart. His Majesty seemed a bit under the weather today. He didn't even attend the reception. Why didn't you tell me the truth, Julia? Why did you keep it from me? Julia paled, wringing her hands nervously. Apologies, Your Majesty. I thought you already knew. I truly did. I didn't mean to disrespect you in any way. Meredith's gaze softened slightly, though the betrayal still stung. Everyone thought I knew, she thought bitterly. Of course they did. After all, I'm the Empress of Vault Sign now. But that title felt hollow. In truth, she felt more like a pawn, manipulated into a marriage without knowing the full extent of what she had been forced into. Julia continued to apologize, but Meredith's mind wandered back to the rumors she had heard whispered behind closed doors. Did my parents trick me into this marriage? Meredith clenched her jaw, fighting the surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm her. What kind of parent would hide such an ugly truth from their daughter? She stood abruptly, her hands gripping the vanity table. I understand, Julia, she said, cutting the woman's apology short. There's no time to discuss the details now. We'll talk later. Julia breathed a sigh of relief. Understood, Your Majesty. I'll make sure to inform you of everything from now on. Good. Meredith paced the room, her thoughts swirling. I can't go to His Majesty tonight. She recalled how pale and weak he had looked. He's too ill for that. The idea of being forced to consummate her marriage with him filled her with dread. I'll let the Central Palace know, she said aloud, and I'll make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Apologies once again, Your Majesty, Julia said before leaving the room, bowing deeply. As the door clicked shut, Meredith sighed, rubbing her temples. The weight of her new life felt heavier by the hour. She had told Julia she wouldn't go to His Majesty's quarters, but would that be a breach of royal etiquette? I should at least be in the same room with him, she reasoned, though her heart wasn't in it. It felt like playing a role, one she had never agreed to. Diane, she called to another servant, prepare my things. I suppose I'll head to his quarters after all. Diane hesitated. Are you sure you can manage on your own, Your Majesty? Meredith gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Of course. We're at the Central Palace, and I have a lamp. I'll be fine. With a heavy sigh, Meredith left her quarters, making her way through the dimly lit halls of the palace. What could possibly go wrong? She thought, trying to shake the unease that crept up her spine. But as she neared the Emperor's chambers, she felt a presence behind her. Before she could react, the door opened. There he was, His Majesty, standing in the shadows, eyes burning with suspicion. I didn't think you were coming, he said, his voice cold and accusing. Meredith swallowed hard. Why are you here? The Emperor continued, his gaze piercing. Did you want to make sure I was dead? What are you talking about? Meredith stammered, her confusion mounting. Don't deny it, the Emperor snapped. I'm sure you knew what was happening. You came late to avoid the attack, didn't you? I'm sure the Empress Dowager informed you in advance. What do you mean? Meredith's heart pounded in her chest. She had never met the Empress Dowager in her life. Why was he accusing her of such things? You're a Schwartz, the Emperor spat, his words dripping with venom. Yet you expect me to believe you have no ties to the Empress Dowager? Meredith blinked, struggling to keep her composure. Is the Empress Dowager working with my family? Her mind raced as she tried to piece it together. I was forced into this marriage, she protested, her voice trembling. I have no idea what's going on. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching as though he contemplated something dangerous. Prove that you're not on the Empress Dowager's side, he hissed, taking a step closer. Because right now it would be easier for me to kill you and blame it on the assassins. One less Schwartz in my life. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. I have to come up with a good reason for him to spare me. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. There's only one thing I have that he needs. What if I could cure your illness? She blurted out, her voice barely above a whisper. The Emperor froze, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Meredith continued, her heart pounding. What if I use my power to treat you, Your Majesty? The room fell into a tense silence as the Emperor's cold gaze lingered on her, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Meredith stood frozen in place, her heart racing as she faced the Emperor. The shadows in the room seemed to creep closer, adding weight to the air between them. She could feel the intensity of his gaze, his skepticism as sharp as a blade against her skin. But she had no choice. If she didn't act now, if she didn't convince him, her life would be forfeit. What if I use my power to treat your illness? Her voice wavered slightly, but the words carried a spark of defiance. She had nothing left to lose. The emperor's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "I didn't say you could talk your way out of this situation," he replied, his tone cold and unforgiving. There was no mercy in his voice. Meredith's breath hitched. "I would do no such thing," she insisted, straightening her spine. "I need to survive this. I have to. I'm confident I can find a cure for your illness." The emperor tilted his head slightly, intrigued, though still guarded. "My illness?" he questioned, doubt creeping into his voice. "Are you saying you know what's wrong with me?" Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. "This is it. I believe," she began carefully, "that you're weak during the day, but at night, you're strong enough to fend off assassins." She kept her voice steady, her eyes locked on his, willing him to believe her. "This has to work." For the first time, the emperor's hardened expression softened into curiosity. He frowned, considering her words. "Weak by day, strong by night," he muttered. "I've never read about such a disease in any medical book." His eyes flickered with interest. "I'm listening." Meredith took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "It's black magic," she said, her voice lowering as if uttering the forbidden words would summon something dark. "Someone has cursed you." The emperor's gaze sharpened. "Black magic?" He leaned forward slightly. "Did you just use magic?" She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is the only way out. I didn't think there were any sorcerers left in Vault Sign," he mused almost to himself. His posture stiffened. "We must travel back in time. 200 years ago, during the reign of Eustianus IV. He executed all the sorcerers of Vault Sign, banned the use of magic. People believe sorcery was wiped out. I am no great sorcerer," Meredith admitted, choosing her words carefully. "But I do have healing magic, which might help." The emperor's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Does that mean the Empress Dowager is also a sorcerer?" Before Meredith could respond, Felix, the emperor's loyal knight, interrupted. "Your Majesty, you don't believe her, do you? She could be lying, trying to make things worse." Meredith turned toward Felix, her voice calm but firm. "What would I gain by lying to His Majesty? Even with me gone, the Empress Dowager would find another woman to take my place." The emperor raised a hand, silencing Felix. "Fine, I shall spare your life for now." His tone was clipped, but there was an undercurrent of grudging respect. "It won't be easy finding someone with healing powers again." Felix clenched his jaw, but said nothing. The emperor stood and walked closer to Meredith, his shadow looming over her. "Let's discuss the details elsewhere," he said. "Follow me." As they moved through the dim corridors, Meredith's thoughts raced. "He spared me. But why? Does he believe me? Or does he have another plan in mind?" She couldn't afford to think too deeply about it now. She just needed to stay alive. They reached a private chamber, the air thick with tension. "How many people know about your illness, Your Majesty?" Meredith asked, breaking the silence. The emperor hesitated. "3 people. Myself, Felix, and my royal physician. Now, including you, it's 4. Is the royal physician someone you can trust?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. "You're one to speak," he shot back. "You have yet to earn my trust." Meredith's lips tightened. "Of course, he doesn't trust me. Why would he?" But she had to keep her calm. "I understand, Your Majesty." The emperor's expression darkened. "I didn't spare you because I trust you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't have to worry about the royal physician. He lost his sister to the Empress Dowager. He's loyal to me." Meredith felt a chill crawl up her spine. "The Empress Dowager, she's at the center of this. I too have a bone to pick with the Schwartz family," the emperor continued, his voice filled with disdain. "I'm sure you never heard of me until the day of the wedding. The Duchess told the world she kept me home because I was frail, but it's a lie. I was treated poorly, like a bastard." Meredith's heart ached with a familiar sting. "He and I were both victims of our families," but she kept her face neutral. "I don't trust anyone fully," the emperor said, his voice quieter now. "Not even myself. But I am human, imperfect like everyone else." Meredith took a deep breath. "He's more vulnerable than he lets on." "Enough with the small talk," the emperor snapped, breaking the fragile moment. Now free me of this curse. Meredith's mind raced. I have to think fast. Well, Your Majesty, curses are difficult to remove. I'm merely a healer. The first step is figuring out what type of curse was placed on you. She paused, hoping he would let her continue. One thing is for sure. The Empress Dowager didn't cast the spell herself. It would take her at least a week to recover from such a curse. The Emperor's gaze hardened. How long will it take to find the cure? Meredith straightened, determination flooding her veins. I swear on my life, I will find it within a week. The Emperor's expression remained cold, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Permission granted to access the forbidden books in the royal library, he said. But mark my words, you must break this curse. Meredith nodded. I know. My life depends on it. As she turned to leave, the Emperor's voice stopped her. No, I want you to stay here tonight. Just you and me. Meredith's heart skipped a beat. Excuse me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What does he want from me now? Stay, the Emperor repeated, his eyes locking onto hers. As the moonlight filtered through the grand windows of the Emperor's chamber, Eleanor felt her heart race. The air between them was thick with tension as the Emperor's voice cut through the silence. I want you to sleep here tonight, he said, his eyes fixed on her, leaving no room for ambiguity. Eleanor blinked, startled. Excuse me? You want me to sleep here? Her voice betrayed her surprise. Just you and me, the Emperor clarified, his tone calm but firm. Eleanor's mind raced. Is he testing me? Is this a trap? She had only just managed to save herself from his sword earlier, and now he wanted her to stay by his side. You can leave, he continued, his voice darkening slightly, if you wish to report back to the Empress Dowager. Or were you planning to tell your staff what happened here tonight? Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized what he was implying. Oh, is that what you meant? She stammered, feeling the weight of his gaze. The Emperor's expression didn't change. I shall sleep on the sofa tonight, Eleanor offered, trying to find some sense of balance in this impossible situation. You can share my bed, he replied, his voice low. There may be another assassination attempt, and I don't want to die alone. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Is he worried about me? Or is this a threat? She couldn't tell, and the uncertainty left her on edge. She swallowed hard. As you wish, Your Majesty, she finally responded, bowing her head slightly. Her thoughts swirled. If the Empress Dowager and the Duke of Schwartz are in this together, did they plan to kill both of us on our wedding night? A chill ran through her. They never considered me part of their family. But to go this far? The anger building in her chest made sleep impossible. She lay stiffly on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Suddenly, the Emperor spoke again, breaking the silence. Are you awake? Eleanor opened her eyes, surprised. No, she responded sarcastically, though her heart raced at his voice. The Emperor let out a quiet laugh, which caught her off guard. Why are you still up, Your Majesty? She asked. He sighed. I spend most of my days in bed, as you know. The nights are when I feel alive. Eleanor turned slightly to face him. I have a question for you, he said, his tone soft but curious. Ask away, Your Majesty. They say magic is inherited. Was your mother a sorceress? Eleanor nodded. Yes, I inherited my magic from her, though I'm surprised there are still sorcerers left in the Empire. The Emperor chuckled softly. It was shocking to see your magic with my own eyes. Eleanor hesitated, then asked, I also have a question for you, Your Majesty. About your condition. Do you become weak from sunrise and strong after sundown? That's right, he said, his voice quiet. Just like a vampire. Eleanor frowned, hearing the bitterness in his voice. It must pain you to know you'll be weak again soon. It does. I get things done at night, when I'm strong. The Empire would fall apart if I didn't. If I don't fulfill my duties, my stepmother would gladly take over. His tone grew colder as he spoke of the Empress Dowager. I strategically place my people throughout the Empire. They think they're working for me, but in truth, they're the ones keeping things running smoothly. Eleanor could hear the weight in his words, the pressure he bore alone. You must be tired, Your Majesty, she said softly. Yes, he admitted. At this rate, I may truly fall ill. She hesitated, then spoke cautiously. You'll play a pivotal role in my recovery. I need you to find a cure for me as soon as possible. When you do, I'll give you anything you want. Eleanor's mind stilled at his offer. Anything I want? The life she'd led before the palace flashed through her mind. The isolation, the harsh treatment at the hands of the Duke of Schwartz. She had never been allowed to want anything for herself. Her voice barely a whisper, she asked, would that require a divorce? The Emperor's brow furrowed slightly, but before he could respond, Eleanor changed the subject. The royal guard didn't know about the attack tonight. The assassins entered through a secret passageway. The Emperor's gaze darkened. We disposed of the bodies through that same passageway. Felix will block it, but it's not the only one that leads to the palace. Eleanor nodded, absorbing the weight of the situation. The danger isn't over. The Emperor's voice softened. I hope I didn't bother you. Eleanor shook her head. Of course not, Your Majesty. Let's call it a night, then, he said, settling into the bed. Good night? Good night, Your Majesty, she replied, though sleep still seemed far away. Just as the silence began to settle over the room, a fit of coughing echoed from the Emperor's side of the bed. Are you all right, Your Majesty? Eleanor asked, concern lacing her words. The Emperor groaned, his voice rough. Is it morning already? Eleanor glanced toward the window. It will be 7 a.m. soon. He sighed heavily. Thank goodness I'm not required to work the day after the wedding. Eleanor could sense the strain in his voice. I can visit the Empress Dowager on my own, she offered. Why don't you get some rest? The Emperor's eyes flashed with something unreadable. Are you sure you can manage on your own? She met his gaze. I won't let you down, Your Majesty. The Emperor studied her for a moment, then nodded. The Empress Dowager is a formidable opponent. Eleanor's heart pounded. I know, but I have no choice. I'm the only one who can break you free, Your Majesty. We're in this together. His expression softened, just for a moment. Yes, and that's the only reason you're alive. Eleanor felt the weight of his words. We're bound together now, whether I like it or not. Fine, he said with a sigh. Consider us shipmates for now. She gave a small, determined nod. Best of luck, dear comrade. For a moment, they shared a quiet understanding. As the morning sun crept into the palace, illuminating the luxurious furnishings of the Emperor's chamber, Meredith stirred from her slumber. She could hear soft voices murmuring outside the door. Sir Felix, she recognized one of the voices, clear and authoritative. Did you sleep well? Yes, thanks to you, came Felix's measured response. Meredith smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest at the thought of the protective night. She shifted slightly, catching snippets of their conversation. He still doesn't trust me, that it was true. The air between her and the Emperor was thick with unspoken words and guarded glances. Last night had been a whirlwind, and the tension still clung to her like a heavy cloak. Your Majesty, Felix urged, you should head inside. One other thing, like I told His Majesty last night, I'm going to pretend I saw nothing. Meredith's heart sank. What did Felix mean by that? What secrets lingered in the shadows? I hope to see you again, Felix, she heard the Emperor say softly, the affection in his voice making her heart flutter. With a deep breath, Meredith entered the room, greeted by the sight of the Emperor's handsome face. Welcome back, Your Majesty, he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. I was in such a rush, I didn't have time, Meredith replied, trying to mask the flurry of emotions within her. She could see he was still processing the events of the previous night. Should I draw a bath, Your Majesty? She asked, a bit nervous. No, before that, he hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought. I was wondering why they were so excited. Meredith caught the glimmer of mischief in his eyes. They must think His Majesty and I spent the night in bed together, she mused, a teasing smile playing on her lips. You seem more excited than me, Julia, he replied, a smirk creeping onto his face. But unfortunately, His Majesty and I nearly got into an argument this morning. I did get my hopes up, she confessed, her tone playful. It's fine, the Emperor said, his expression softening. Is Her Highness the Empress Dowager awake? She wakes up every morning at 6 a.m., Julia informed him, and Meredith felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. What would the Empress Dowager think of her? Well then, shall we go pay her a visit? The Emperor suggested, standing straighter, a sense of purpose returning to him. As they approached the Empress Dowager's palace, Meredith marveled at its grandeur. Her palace is as fancy as mine, she thought, but her excitement was tinged with anxiety. The tea will soon be ready, Your Majesty. If you'll give us a minute, Julia announced as they entered the elegant sitting room. Meredith sat down, suddenly feeling smaller in the presence of such opulence. She thought she would be more nervous, but the events of last night had left her shaken. I was wondering who it could be, she murmured, her mind racing. Well, if it isn't my daughter-in-law, a voice drawled, and Meredith looked up to see the Empress Dowager enter, regal and imposing. Blair Valtzine. Meredith recognized her as the former concubine of the late emperor, now the stepmother to the current emperor. The mother of Prince Fabian, she recalled, her mind racing back to the story she had heard. Greetings to Her Majesty, the Empress Dowager, she said, forcing herself to maintain composure. My child, there's no need for formalities. Please have a seat, Blair replied, her tone surprisingly warm. Meredith raised an eyebrow. My child? That sounded funny. She felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her. You must be tired from the wedding ceremony, Blair continued, a hint of motherly concern in her voice. Nicola, go fetch some refreshments. I'm fine, Your Majesty. I'm here to pay my respects, Meredith insisted, although the situation felt more like a test than a simple visit. You're visiting me for the first time. How could I possibly send you back without offering anything? Blair smiled knowingly. Thank you, Your Majesty, Meredith replied, a hint of wariness creeping into her voice. That was a subtle way of telling me to stay longer. She seems to be a force to be reckoned with. Now then, tell me all about last night, Blair said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Meredith hesitated, glancing at the Emperor, who looked equally apprehensive. I didn't think she'd be so direct. There's no need to be shy. As you can see, I'm not very good at beating around the bush, Blair added, her demeanor encouraging. I've been there and done that. Now I want details, she continued, a playful smirk gracing her lips. Meredith sighed, biting her lip. The thing is, His Majesty wasn't feeling well, so I heard that you refused to go to the Central Palace last night, Blair interjected, her tone sharp. Yes, His Majesty skipped the reception because he wasn't feeling well, Meredith replied, her heart racing. Did I just contradict royal protocol? Be as it may, your actions went against royal protocol. You did good, Blair said, surprising her. I thought you would be upset because His Majesty wasn't feeling well. You seem to have a good heart, my child. You flatter me, Your Majesty, Meredith murmured, taken aback by the unexpected praise. Blair's gaze turned serious. Did you say your name was Meredith? Welcome to the Valtzine family, Meredith. I heard so much about you from Duke Schwartz. Meredith felt her heart skip a beat. The Duke? What did he say? I'm curious. How exactly did my father describe me, Your Majesty? She asked, seizing the opportunity to gather information. Blair's expression shifted thoughtfully. He said you were clever, kind, and he also praised your beauty, and I can see for myself that he was right, Your Majesty, Meredith replied, a small smile forming on her lips. Did my father convince you that I would make a good bride for His Majesty? She asked, a touch of defiance in her tone. Your sister is Catalina, right? Duke Schwartz said she wasn't prepared to take on such an important role, Blair noted, her gaze penetrating. Father must think more highly of me than I thought, Meredith mused, a glimmer of pride swelling within her. Not everyone can be the Empress of Valtzine. And it doesn't matter if you were the younger sister, Blair stated, her tone firm. Of course not, Meredith agreed, though doubts lingered in the back of her mind. I know very well. There's something I wish to ask of you, Blair said, her voice lowering slightly. What is it, Your Majesty? Meredith replied, curious and cautious. First, I'd like you to treat me as if I were your own mother, Blair declared, her gaze unwavering. As if you were my own mother? Meredith echoed, shock flooding her system. What kind of game is she playing? We are destined to live in the royal palace together. Feel free to refer to me as Mother, Meredith, Blair added, her smile disarming but unsettling. The words felt heavy, and Meredith's mind raced with thoughts of her real mother, lost and forgotten. Over my dead body, she thought bitterly, yet she kept her expression neutral. Thank you for your kind offer, she said finally, a diplomatic tone masking her true feelings. But I have not yet fully mastered royal etiquette. I wouldn't want to offend you in any way. I promise to do my best once I get settled into the royal palace, Meredith added, trying to maintain her composure. Do you have another favor to ask of me? Blair pressed, her gaze narrowing with interest. Oh, right, Meredith replied, her heart racing at the thought of what Blair might ask. As the Empress of Sign, I know you'll be spending a lot of time with His Majesty. Having said that, could you check up on His Majesty's health and report back to me periodically? Blair's eyes gleamed, and Meredith realized that she was being pulled into a web of intrigue, a player in a game that was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. What have I gotten myself into? Meredith wondered as she nodded, steeling herself for the role she was about to undertake. In the grand palace of Sign, the air was thick with tension and unspoken words. Meredith, the newly crowned empress, found herself seated in the opulent chambers of the Empress Dowager, Blair Sign. The walls echoed with secrets, and Meredith's heart raced as she realized the weight of her new title and the delicate game she had entered. Could you check on His Majesty's health and report back to me periodically? Blair's voice was deceptively sweet, yet there was an unmistakable command beneath it. Meredith's mind whirled, considering the implications. The Empress Dowager, though polite, was clearly concerned about her son, the Emperor, and it became increasingly apparent that she wanted to keep a close watch on him. But the way Blair had worded her request felt like a subtle maneuver, a demand masked as a favor. His Majesty hasn't been feeling well these days, Blair continued, her eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing Meredith's reaction. He stopped visiting me every morning. I have no idea how he is doing. The worry in her voice tugged at Meredith's heart. She felt the desire to help the Empress Dowager, but also the weight of her newfound position. So, in other words, the thought echoed in Meredith's mind. Blair wished for her to be her spy. Yet, in a flash, another realization struck her. A true mother would never curse her son with black magic. It was a thought that left a bitter taste in Meredith's mouth. Despite her reservations, she nodded, "Of course, Your Majesty." Blair's face brightened with a smile that was both relieved and calculating. "So you'll do it?" "That's right. How could I turn you down, Your Majesty?" Meredith's mind raced. How could she refuse without raising suspicion? "Thank you for being so kind," Blair continued, her tone dripping with warmth that felt insincere. "I'm glad I have another person to confide in. Aside from the morning visits, you can come see me anytime you wish." The words wrapped around Meredith like a golden chain, both inviting and constraining. "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied, feeling the sincerity of her own voice falter. "You've shown me such kindness. I shall look up to you as if you were my own mother." The declaration hung in the air, heavy with irony, as Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope over an abyss. "I'm so happy to have you as my daughter-in-law," Blair said, a hint of triumph in her voice. The implication was clear. Meredith was now a pawn in a grander scheme. "I look forward to our time together, Meredith." Meredith forced a smile, though the weight of her new role felt crushing. She sensed Blair's keen watchfulness, the way her eyes flickered with an intensity that reminded her of a hawk watching its prey. The Empress Dowager seemed to know more than she let on. As the conversation shifted, Meredith couldn't help but notice how pale Blair appeared, as if the pressure of her title bore down on her too. "You look rather pale, Your Majesty," she remarked, masking her concern with a note of formality. "Yes, I'm feeling pretty tired," Blair replied, her voice softening. "Did something happen while you were inside?" A subtle glimmer of suspicion crossed her features, and Meredith felt a shiver run down her spine. For all she knew, Julia, the attendant, could be one of the Empress Dowager's people. It wouldn't hurt to be careful, she thought, her instincts urging caution. "I must have been nervous in the presence of the Empress Dowager," she admitted, hoping her honesty would placate Blair's suspicions. "I see," Blair said, her gaze piercing. "But Julia seems to be a good person." Meredith forced a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. His Majesty must be rubbing off on me, she joked. You look very tired, Your Majesty. Why don't we head back and get some rest? Oh, wait, Blair interjected. I need to stop by the Central Palace first. I must see how His Majesty is doing. There was an urgency in her voice that struck Meredith as unsettling. As they parted, Meredith's heart raced. The stakes were high, and she felt the burden of being entangled in this royal web of intrigue. She arrived at the Central Palace, determined to find the Emperor, Felix. Stepping into his study, she found him absorbed in a book, an unexpected sight. Greetings to our venerable Emperor, she said, trying to mask her own apprehensions. I didn't expect you to come by so soon. It's still morning, Empress, Felix replied, a hint of surprise lacing his tone. I know, Your Majesty, but there's something I wanted to tell you. Meredith took a breath, her resolve hardening. It seems you went to see the Empress Dowager. She asked me to check on your condition and report back to her during our morning visits. Felix's expression darkened with amusement and irritation. So, she has no idea what happened last night. I did my best to fool her, but who knows? Meredith admitted, glancing down at her hands. I can imagine how things went, he replied dryly. But you're a terrible actress. Meredith felt a flush of embarrassment. It doesn't matter whether she saw through you or not. She probably didn't trust you from the very beginning, even if you didn't do anything wrong in her presence. Felix's voice dropped, carrying a weight of sincerity. The Empress Dowager came from a small noble family, but managed to capture the former emperor's heart. She's the type to make the impossible possible. I thought so, Meredith replied, a sense of unease settling in her stomach. What will you do now? Felix asked, leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on her. I'm going to continue to inform her that you're not feeling well. Meredith's voice was steady, though doubt tugged at her thoughts. It's the truth. Felix's gaze sharpened. What else? Your Majesty, I have something to ask of you. She gathered her courage, the moment fraught with uncertainty. I'd like to meet the physician you trust. I need more information on your current condition. Jerome Boner. That's his name, Felix said, his tone even. Is there a way I could meet him without looking suspicious? That could be arranged, he replied, considering her question. Say you're having trouble sleeping. There's no other person in the palace who knows more about insomnia than Jerome Boner. And it is also our secret code. I understand, Your Majesty, Meredith said, her heart racing with the weight of the plan unfolding before her. I'll report back to you if I find anything. Get some rest, Your Majesty, Felix advised, concern lacing his words. As she prepared to leave, a nagging doubt lingered in her mind. You don't seem very happy, he noted, observing her closely. Do you really trust Her Majesty? Meredith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't seem to be lying, he replied, his gaze fixed on the distance. In fact, she's a terrible actress. You must keep your guard up. Felix's words echoed in her mind as she turned to leave. She understood the weight of his caution, the precarious balance of trust and betrayal that hung in the air. I don't trust anyone, he declared firmly. But enough. Unless you can find another sorcerer to cure me, I want you to keep your mouth shut. The depth of his frustration resonated within her. To be honest, he continued, I don't care who it is, as long as they can break me free from this godforsaken headache. With a heavy heart, Meredith stepped out into the palace corridors, knowing that every move she made could tip the balance of power in this world of shadows and whispers. Her role was clear, yet the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and she felt the looming shadows of the past and present intertwining in a dangerous dance. In the heart of the sprawling vault-sign palace, the morning light filtered through the grand windows, casting gentle rays on the plush carpets. Meredith, the Empress, sat at her vanity, staring into the ornate mirror as thoughts swirled in her mind. She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of sleepless nights pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. I've been having trouble sleeping, she murmured, the words barely above a whisper. Julia, her attentive maid, looked up from where she was arranging the Empress's delicate gowns. What should I do, Julia? At this rate, I'll be up all night. Did you say you're having trouble sleeping, Your Majesty? Julia's eyes widened with concern, and Meredith could sense her eagerness to help. "That's right," she replied, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "It started last night. I got zero sleep because of His Majesty. I thought it was because I was nervous about the wedding night, but I think I should do something about my insomnia." Julia nodded, her expression serious. "I'll call for the royal physician, Your Majesty. Make sure to find someone who knows how to deal with insomnia," Meredith instructed, her mind racing with the implications of her request. What if this physician could uncover secrets she wasn't ready to confront? What if he figured out the secret code she and Felix had devised? Moments later, the door creaked open, and a tall man stepped inside. "Greetings, Your Majesty. You must be Jerome Boner at your service," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. Meredith felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this physician could help her navigate this complicated web of palace intrigue. Felix had filled Jerome in on the news, and Meredith felt a sense of relief wash over her. "That will make things easier," she said, trying to steady her nerves. "How long have you been working at the palace?" "I was hired when His Majesty ascended the throne." "So, not that long," Jerome replied, a slight smile on his lips. Meredith's curiosity piqued. "I see. Until then, I had no intention of stepping foot inside the royal palace." There was a hint of something in his tone, a reluctance perhaps, and she couldn't help but wonder what had drawn him into their world. "Is that so?" she asked, keeping her tone light even as her heart raced with questions. As if sensing her unspoken thoughts, Julia chimed in. "His Majesty said Jerome lost his younger sister." Meredith's brow furrowed, the mention of loss resonating with her. She felt a pang of sympathy for him, yet a cautious voice in her head warned her against probing too deeply. "I don't know the details, but maybe he came to the palace seeking revenge." "Man," Julia said, her tone turning serious. "It may be rude to ask for more details." Jerome, however, remained focused. "I want all the details regarding His Majesty's illness," he said, his voice steady. "That's exactly why I came to see you today," Meredith replied, feeling the tension in the air shift as she navigated the conversation. Jerome's expression grew more serious. "But there's nothing highly unusual. Could you elaborate?" Meredith pressed, leaning in with genuine concern. "His Majesty is sickly during the day," Jerome explained, his tone clinical yet compassionate. "He suffers from flu-like symptoms and headaches." A flicker of worry crossed Meredith's face as Jerome continued. "There's also the dry cough, and sometimes he runs a high fever, nausea, and tinnitus." As the physician spoke, Meredith felt a swell of emotions. The weight of her responsibilities felt heavier than ever. She had married into a family burdened with expectations and secrets, and now she was entangled in a web of health crises and royal duties. Her thoughts raced back to her own sleepless nights, tangled with anxiety and uncertainty. "How long do you think these symptoms will last?" Meredith asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fear creeping into her heart. Jerome hesitated for a moment, assessing her. "It's hard to say, Your Majesty, but I will do everything in my power to help His Majesty recover." Meredith nodded, feeling a surge of determination. She would not only protect Felix but also uncover the truth behind the illness that had cast a shadow over their lives. She couldn't let herself falter now. Too much was at stake. With newfound resolve, she decided to place her trust in Jerome, hoping he would be the ally she needed to navigate this complex royal labyrinth. As the sun began to rise over Vault-Sign Palace, its golden rays filtered through the heavy curtains of the Empress's chambers. Meredith sat at her ornate table, the weight of her worries settling on her like a thick fog. She had just learned from Jerome Boner, the royal physician, that her husband, Felix, was suffering from multiple distressing symptoms. "So, he's suffering from multiple symptoms?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Yes. I fear I won't be of much help, Your Majesty," Jerome replied, his demeanor serious but respectful. "Are there days when he feels better than usual?" Meredith pressed, desperate for any hint of good news. "The day of the full moon, for example." Jerome's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Oh, you're right," she exclaimed, recalling Felix's renewed energy during the moonlit nights. He does have more energy on the day of the full moon. That's because black magic weakens during that time, Jerome stated matter-of-factly. Meredith's heart raced at his words. Black magic? The notion twisted in her mind like a thorny vine. This was more than just an illness. It confirmed her worst fears, that her husband had been cursed. This proves my theory that His Majesty was cursed through black magic, she murmured, a determined spark igniting within her. I thought so, Jerome said, offering a small nod of affirmation. Thank you, Sir Jerome. Because of you, I may be able to find a cure more quickly. A sense of hope washed over Meredith. Perhaps they could unravel this dark mystery together. I heard you are a sorceress with healing magic, Your Majesty, Jerome added, a note of admiration lacing his voice. Yes, I have yet to hone my skills, though. She felt a mix of pride and embarrassment, a strange juxtaposition that was becoming all too familiar. That's amazing, he replied, his eyes widening. It was shocking to hear that a sorceress still existed in the Empire. Healing magic is rare, to begin with. Meredith reflected on her gift, one she had been born with yet struggled to master. I was lucky enough to be born with my magic. It was both a blessing and a burden, especially in a palace filled with intrigue and uncertainty. I respect that you worked hard to become the physician that you are today, she said, gratitude softening her voice. You flatter me, Your Majesty, Jerome replied, his modesty a refreshing change in a world of egos and pretensions. It's a relief to know there's a trustworthy physician in the palace, Meredith admitted, feeling a swell of determination. I'm looking forward to working with you, Jerome. Do you trust me, Your Majesty? He asked, a glimmer of vulnerability breaking through his professional facade. You're one of His Majesty's people, she replied, weighing her words carefully. And not only that, only I can break His Majesty free from his curse, Jerome interjected, and Meredith could sense his urgency. The health of the healer is essential to maximize the healing process, he continued, his gaze steady. If I were to fall ill, I would have to turn to you for help. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't want to think about failing Felix, nor did she want Dr. Jerome to hold her in contempt, like Sir Felix did. I don't want Dr. Jerome to hate me, like Sir Felix does. I'm going to definitely need his help along the way, she thought, her resolve hardening. I want you to think of me as you think of His Majesty. Of course, Your Majesty, Jerome replied, his voice earnest. My apologies for asking such a silly question, she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. Please don't hesitate to call if you need my services. I do have a favor to ask of you, he said, his tone shifting to one of sincerity. Of course. As you know, I'm a healer. I became interested in medicine because I thought it would help with my healing powers. Meredith listened intently as he spoke, her heart warming at the thought of his dedication. I've been studying in secret all my life. That makes sense, Your Majesty. She admired his passion, but couldn't help but feel a sense of kinship. I'm sure my knowledge is meager compared to yours, Sir Boner. The only books I could find were introductory books on medicine. There was a hint of frustration in his voice, and Meredith found herself wishing she could help him more. Why is she being so modest? She wondered, her admiration for him growing. Would your favor be? I'd like to continue on with my studies, Jerome proposed, hope flickering in his eyes. Could you help me? Of course, Your Majesty. That wasn't a difficult ask at all. You can come see me any time at the Royal Hospital, he added, a smile breaking across his face. Thank you. I'll do that, Meredith said, feeling a swell of gratitude. You can take your leave now, she said, and as he turned to go, he hesitated for a moment. Oh, one more thing, Your Majesty. I need an excuse for visiting you today. Let's say that I prescribed a potion to soothe your nerves, Jerome suggested, his tone lightening. It isn't a sleeping potion, but it will help you relax and fall asleep more easily. Now, if you'll excuse me. With a slight bow, he departed, leaving Meredith in a whirlwind of thoughts. She breathed deeply, the weight of her responsibilities settling on her shoulders once more. In order to gain their trust, I have to find a way to treat His Majesty. The stakes were high, and every moment felt charged with possibility. Once he is fully recovered, He may let his guard down, she mused, a longing for a peaceful life swelling within her. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. "It's Julia, Your Majesty. You may enter." "I received the potion from the royal physician," Julia announced, her voice filled with energy. "I'll bring it right this minute, Your Majesty." "Would you?" Meredith replied, her head throbbing. "Ugh, my head hurts." "He said you were probably stressed trying to adjust to a new environment." So that's what Dr. Boner told Julia, she thought, realizing the concern he had for her well-being. "I'm sure I'll get better soon," she assured Julia, though uncertainty gnawed at her. "There's no need to worry. Oh, and one other thing," she added, as an idea struck her. "I want to discuss tomorrow's schedule with you." "I'd like to go to the Royal Library," she said, excitement bubbling within her. "There are some books I'd like to read." With determination fueling her actions, Meredith resolved to unearth the secrets of healing, both for her husband and for herself. The path ahead was uncertain, but she would face it with courage, armed with knowledge and the support of those around her.